60 years is a long time to be underestimated. Humanity had joined the Galactic Coalition in what the official records described as a historic moment of interstellar cooperation and what most of the Coalition's established member species privately described as an administrative inevitability. The humans had achieved jump capability and made contact, and once those two things happened, the membership application was essentially a formality that the Coalition processed because its own charter required it to. The 17 civilizations that made up the Coalition had been doing this for centuries. Building frameworks, managing relationships, conducting the complex and ongoing work of keeping a collection of very different species from making each other's lives significantly worse. They were good at it. They had the institutional memory and the established protocols and the long experience of knowing which problems were real and which were noise. They looked at humanity and they saw noise. Not malicious noise. Not threatening noise. Just the particular loud and disorganized energy of a young species that had recently discovered it was not alone in the universe and had not yet learned how to be quiet about it. Humans asked too many questions in the wrong forums. They pushed on issues that the established members had long since agreed to leave alone because leaving them alone was what made the rest of the framework function. They formed opinions quickly and expressed them completely and seemed genuinely confused by the concept of saying less than you thought in a diplomatic context. The Coalition handled this the way experienced institutions handle disruptive newcomers. With patience. With the particular brand of inclusive-sounding language that actually meant we will let you sit at the table and we will listen to you say things and we will then proceed with what we were already going to do. Humanity was invited to sessions. Humanity was given committee positions. Humanity was treated with every external courtesy of full membership. Humanity was not factored into anything that actually mattered. This had been the arrangement for 60 years. The established members were not cruel about it. They genuinely believed they were being appropriately measured, giving the new species time to develop, to learn, to grow into something that could contribute meaningfully to the Coalition's work. They were, in their own understanding of the situation, being patient and generous. What they were not being was attentive. The Keth Empire had been a concern on the Coalition's eastern boundary for a decade before it became a crisis. The Keth were not a member species. They had declined membership and made their position on the Coalition's existence clear enough that the relationship had been managed at a careful distance. For most of that decade, managed at a careful distance had been sufficient. Then the expansion began. The first civilization absorbed was small, a single-system species with limited defensive capability. The Coalition noted it with concern and sent diplomatic communications that were not responded to. The second was larger and had been a Coalition observer state for 30 years, and its absorption sent a clear signal about what the Keth thought of Coalition relationships as a protective factor. The third absorption happened faster than the first two combined, and by the time the fourth civilization was under active pressure, the Coalition's defensive line was being tested for the first time in a generation. The Emergency Military Coordination Request was drafted by the Coalition Senior Council over 4 days of intensive session. It was a serious document. It allocated contributions from each member species based on assessed military capability, established a unified command structure, set out the operational framework for the collective defense effort. It went through 7 drafts. Senior diplomatic and military staff from the major member species reviewed and revised it. The human copy was shorter than the others. The contribution request was not based on assessed military capability, it was a general request for whatever token contribution humanity could reasonably provide. The language was considerate and polite and reflected the Coalition's honest assessment of what humanity was likely to have available. It arrived at humanity's diplomatic office on a Thursday morning. Ambassador Cole Briggs was at his desk when the courier brought it. He was a compact, unhurried man in his mid-50s who had been in the diplomatic role for 9 years and who had spent those 9 years developing a comprehensive understanding of exactly how the Coalition viewed humanity and exactly what that view was worth. He picked up the document, read it completely, set it down. He thanked the courier. The courier left. He sat at his desk for a moment. Not reading anything. Not making notes. Just sitting with the document in front of him and the expression on his face doing something that was difficult to describe and that the translation office, reviewing the video confirmation he sent back 20 minutes later, would note in their log as difficult to categorize. The confirmation was brief. Humanity acknowledged the request. Humanity would send what it could. Humanity looked forward to contributing to the collective defense of Coalition member civilizations. He sent it. He closed his desk terminal. He picked up his coffee. Then he made 3 calls to 3 different people in 3 different offices, and the conversations were short and the same phrase appeared in all 3 of them: go ahead and move the timeline up. The translation office filed their log note about his expression and moved on to the next item. They would think about that expression later. Quite a lot, as it turned out. The quarterly reports went back 42 years. Every member species in the coalition was subject to the standard monitoring framework, regular intelligence assessments compiled by the coalition's analytical division, covering economic development, military capability, industrial output, and political stability. The framework had been designed to give the coalition's leadership an accurate picture of its membership at any given time and to flag developments that required attention or response. The human reports were filed every quarter without exception. The analysts who wrote them were professional and thorough and drew on a wide range of data sources: trade records, publicly available industrial figures, the reports of coalition survey teams that visited human facilities on a rotating schedule, diplomatic communications, and the general open-source information that humanity produced in quantities that were frankly difficult to fully process because humans documented and published and broadcasted at a rate that no other member species came close to matching. The reports for the first decade after membership described a species in early development. Expanding economy, growing infrastructure, the normal pattern of a newly spacefaring civilization building the industrial foundation that interstellar presence required. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that the established pattern recognition built into the monitoring framework flagged as requiring elevated attention. The reports for the second decade described the same thing at a larger scale. The industrial base had grown significantly. Human shipbuilding capacity had expanded. The military figures showed moderate growth consistent with a species developing a defensive capability appropriate to its size and position. The analysts noted the growth, categorized it correctly within the existing framework and moved on. The third decade. Fourth decade. The same consistent picture of a developing economy progressing along expected lines. The framework was the problem, not the analysts. The analysts were doing their jobs correctly. The framework they were using had been built over centuries by the established coalition powers to monitor development trajectories that they understood, the familiar patterns of civilizations that were developing within the parameters that everyone involved understood to be parameters. The upper limit on warship construction was one of those parameters. It was not a legal restriction. It was a physical and engineering reality that the established powers had run into at various points in their own development and had studied and concluded was a genuine ceiling. You could not build a functional warship past a certain scale because the structural, propulsion, and systems integration challenges above that scale were not solvable with any known engineering approach. This conclusion had been reached by some of the most technically capable civilizations in the coalition. It had been peer-reviewed across multiple species. It was in the technical literature going back 200 years. It was, as far as the established powers were concerned, simply true. Humanity had read the same literature. The engineers who founded the program that would eventually be designated Site 7 had read all of it carefully and thoroughly and had come away from it with a different conclusion than the one the established powers had reached. Not because the established powers had made errors exactly. Because the established powers had read the literature and concluded impossible and humanity's engineers had read the same literature and concluded not yet solved. The distinction seemed small. It was not small. The program started quietly in the outer Kepler system 41 years ago. Not secretly, humanity had never hidden the existence of its outer shipyards, and the coalition survey teams that visited twice in 4 decades had seen the facilities and documented them and categorized them accurately within the existing framework. Large industrial complex. Significant construction capability. Output consistent with documented human military development trajectory. What the survey teams had not done was ask what specifically was being built. The facilities were large but not anomalously large. The industrial output figures were high but consistent with the growth trend the quarterly reports had been tracking. Nothing about what they observed triggered the questions that would have led to the answers that would have changed everything about how those reports read. Inside Site 7, the engineering teams were doing what engineering teams do when they have been given a genuinely hard problem and the resources to work on it and enough time. They were working. Systematically. Iteratively. Building, testing, failing, learning from the failure, building again. The propulsion problem took 11 years. The structural integration challenge took 8 more. The systems architecture for something operating at that scale was a decade of work on its own. Every solution created 3 new problems and every new problem generated a research program and every research program eventually produced an answer and the answers accumulated over 40 years into something that had never existed before. The first vessel was completed in Site 7's primary construction bay 14 years ago. It took 3 years to build and another 2 to fully test and bring to operational status. The figures that came back from the testing program were documented internally and not shared through any coalition reporting channel because they were not required to be, and because humanity had learned over 60 years of coalition membership that the established powers had a particular way of receiving information that challenged their existing frameworks. The way was, they didn't. So the testing figures stayed internal. The construction of the second vessel began while the first was still in final testing. Then the third. The quarterly reports continued to describe a developing economy with an expanding industrial base and moderate military growth and nothing requiring elevated monitoring priority. The coalition analysts filed them as they had always filed them. Accurate, thorough, and built on a framework that had one quiet gap running through the center of it, the assumption that the upper limit was a limit and not a problem that someone was 40 years into solving. By the time the Keth expansion became a crisis, there were 6 vessels at Site 7 in various stages of completion and operational readiness. The 6th had come online 8 months before the emergency coordination request landed on Ambassador Briggs's desk. He had known the 6th was coming online. He had known the timeline. He had been managing the information about the timeline for 2 years. When he made his 3 calls after sending the confirmation and said go ahead and move the timeline up, he was not improvising. He was executing the last step of a plan that had been 40 years in development and that had been waiting for exactly this moment, not because humanity had wanted a war, but because humanity had read the same reports about the Keth that everyone else had read and had thought further ahead than the question of whether a conflict was coming. They had thought about what would actually be needed to end one. The answer had taken 40 years and the industrial output of the outer Kepler system and 6 construction bays at Site 7. It was ready now. The Keth expansion fleet had been moving for 8 years without stopping. Not without pausing for resupply or tactical repositioning, those were operational necessities and they happened. But without stopping in the sense that mattered. Without encountering anything that made the fleet's command structure look at the situation and make a genuine assessment of whether continuing was the right decision. The question of whether to continue had simply not come up in 8 years because nothing had presented itself as a reason to ask it. 4,000 ships. It was not the largest fleet the Keth had ever assembled. Their history included larger mobilizations during the consolidation period 2 centuries ago. But it was the most capable fleet they had ever deployed, built from Keth engineering and supplemented by the absorbed technology of 3 civilizations that had each added something to the collective capability. The sensor systems from the second absorption were particularly valued. The weapons integration from the third had taken 2 years to fully incorporate, and the result had been a fleet that was measurably more capable than the one that had started the expansion campaign. It had absorbed everything it encountered and become better from each absorption. The coalition's defensive line was the first thing it had encountered that did not absorb immediately. The line was holding on day 14. Not comfortably. Comfortably was not a word that applied to any aspect of the coalition's defensive situation. The combined fleet was outnumbered in vessels and outmatched in several specific capability categories, and the officers commanding it knew both of those things with the precise clarity of people who had run the numbers and understood what the numbers said. They were holding with discipline and with cost and with the specific organizational quality of a force that has accepted it as buying time and has committed to buying as much of it as possible. Day 14. The morning watch on the Coalition Tactical Network was running the standard sensor sweep of the outer approach corridors, the areas behind the defensive line, the jump points through which reinforcement or resupply might come. Standard procedure. Done every 6 hours throughout the engagement. The sweep returned an anomaly at the outer jump point. Emergence signatures. Multiple. The tactical officer running the sweep looked at the readings and ran the standard identification protocol, cross-referencing the emergence pattern against the known signature libraries for all coalition member vessels, all neutral state vessels, all documented Keth vessel types. No match returned. She flagged it as an unknown contact and escalated it to the watch commander while simultaneously running the scaling analysis that would give her the approximate size of what had emerged. The scaling analysis returned a number. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she ran it again because that was the procedure when a sensor return produced a result outside expected parameters. The second run returned the same number. She noted in her log that the reading appeared to be a probable equipment malfunction and sent the raw data to the senior sensor officer for review. The senior sensor officer, a focused, technically precise woman named Lieutenant Commander Patel who had been in signals and sensor analysis for 16 years and who had never once filed an equipment malfunction report that turned out to be actual equipment malfunction, received the data and ran her own analysis on the secondary system. Independent hardware, independent software, the same raw sensor input. The numbers were identical. She sat with this for a moment. 16 years of sensor work had given her a very well-calibrated sense of what anomalous readings were and what they weren't, and what she was looking at did not have the signature of equipment failure. Equipment failures produced inconsistent results. This was producing the same consistent result across two independent systems, and the consistency of it was what made it significant rather than dismissible. She wrote a note to Fleet Command. It was 3 sentences. The readings from the outer jump point were confirmed on independent systems. The scaling data was consistent across both analyses. She had no explanation for the figures, but she wanted Fleet Command to be aware that they appeared to be accurate. She attached the full data package and sent it. In the Keth Fleet sensor section, the same emergent signatures had been picked up on their equipment within seconds of the Coalition's detection. The Keth sensor operators were experienced, and their equipment was among the best in the expansion fleet, the product of 3 civilizations' worth of sensor technology integrated into a single system. They ran the initial analysis. The result came back. The senior Keth sensor operator looked at it with the particular expression of a technically competent professional encountering a number that does not fit any category they have been trained to work with. He flagged it as probable sensor malfunction and sent it to his superior. His superior ran it on the backup system. Same result. He sent it to Fleet Command with a notation that the backup system had confirmed the primary reading and that he was escalating for senior review because the reading was outside any documented parameter. Keth Fleet Command received both the primary and backup analyses within the same minute. The senior tactical officer pulled up the data on the command display and looked at it. The emergent signatures showed 6 contacts at the outer jump point. 6 was not an alarming number. 6 was a small reinforcement package at best. 6 was a token gesture at worst. And in the context of a 14-day engagement against a coalition fleet that had been taking losses and holding through discipline alone, 6 additional contacts was not something the Keth Fleet Command needed to restructure its tactical approach to address. The tactical officer began formulating the standard assessment for a small contact emergence. Then the scaling data finished processing. He stopped formulating the standard assessment. The scaling data was showing 6 contacts. The scaling data was also showing size figures that were. He checked the display settings to confirm he was reading the correct units. Not possible. Not impossible in the theoretical sense of violating physical law. Impossible in the sense of being larger than any vessel classification in the Keth tactical database by a margin that was not marginal. By a margin that suggested whoever had built these things had read the engineering literature on upper limits and had arrived at a fundamentally different conclusion about what those limits actually were. He sent the data to the Fleet Senior Command with a request for immediate review. The Keth Fleet Senior Command was not a group that alarmed easily. 8 years of successful expansion and the complete absence of any engagement that had not concluded in their favor had produced a command culture of confident assessment and decisive action. They received the data and reviewed it and ran it on 3 separate systems and got 3 consistent results. Then they did something the expansion fleet had not done in 8 years. They sent a general alert to all 4,000 ships. Not an attack alert. Not a defensive formation order. Just a general alert. The category that meant something has happened that we do not have a standard response to, and all commanders should be aware and standing by. The advance stopped. Not in the disorganized way of a fleet breaking contact. In the deliberate way of a fleet whose command structure has encountered something it does not have a prepared response to and is taking a moment to think about what the prepared response should be. In the Coalition's tactical center, the watch officer who had sent the original anomaly report was now watching her display as the 6 emergent signatures completed their transit through the jump point and moved into the approach corridor. Moving at standard approach speed. Running identification beacons. Broadcasting on the Coalition's shared tactical frequency. Calm and unhurried, and proceeding with the complete professionalism of vessels whose crews had done this 100 times and knew exactly what they were doing. 6 contacts. Coming through a jump point that was behind the defensive line. Broadcasting Coalition identification. She pulled up the identification data. Human registry. 6 vessels. The designation on each one was a Site 7 registry number she did not recognize because Site 7 was not in any database she had access to. She escalated to Fleet Command. Fleet Command looked at the identification data and then at the scaling figures and then back at the identification data. Human vessels. The Coalition fleet's commander, a senior officer who had been managing the defensive engagement for 14 days with the steady and expensive discipline that the situation required, sat at his command position and looked at the display showing 6 human vessels of a size that his sensor systems were having difficulty fully processing, and thought about the coordination request his government had sent to humanity 3 weeks ago and the response that had come back saying humanity would send what it could. He looked at the display for another moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else and opened a channel to his tactical staff and told them to clear approach corridor 7 for the incoming human vessels and to do it quickly. Behind the defensive line the Keth advance remained paused. The 6 contacts continued their approach. Unhurried. Getting larger on every display that was tracking them as they came. 6 ships. That was the number that went through both fleets' communications in the first few minutes after the emergent signatures resolved into confirmed contacts. 6 ships. The Coalition Tactical Network logged it. The Keth Fleet's command system logged it. Everyone who was paying attention to the outer jump point situation received the same confirmed contact number. 6. The Coalition tactical officers who processed the number first felt something that was difficult to describe cleanly. They had been holding a defensive line for 14 days against 4,000 ships. They had been doing it with discipline and with losses and with the specific internal experience of people who are performing at the edge of what is sustainable and know it. They had sent the coordination request 3 weeks ago and humanity had responded and humanity was sending what it could and what it could apparently amounted to 6 vessels. 6 versus 4,000. The feeling was complicated. Not contempt. These were professional officers in the middle of a serious engagement and contempt was not a mode they were operating in. Something more like the particular sadness of receiving help that is not going to change the situation in any meaningful way from people who clearly meant well. 6 human ships joining a coalition fleet that was already struggling was not a development that changed the strategic picture. It was a gesture. A sincere one probably. But a gesture. They cleared approach corridor 7 anyway because that was the professional thing to do and because every vessel helped in some marginal sense and because the coalition's relationship with humanity, whatever its limitations, was still a relationship worth maintaining. In the Keth Fleet's command section the 6 contacts produced a different response. Not complicated. Considerably simpler and considerably less generous. The Keth expansion fleet had absorbed 3 civilizations. It had engaged coalition forces for 14 days. It had been built from the combined military technology of everything it had ever defeated and it had never lost and its command culture reflected all of that history in the specific way that command cultures reflect histories of uninterrupted success. They looked at their sensor display showing 6 additional contacts emerging to reinforce a coalition fleet that was already losing and they felt the thing you feel when an opponent does something that confirms your existing assessment of them. They felt contempt. Clean and simple and completely certain of itself. 6 ships. The humans had sent 6 ships. Of course they had. The Keth tactical staff noted the new contacts and categorized them as negligible reinforcement and returned their primary attention to the main defensive line where the actual engagement was ongoing. 6 additional vessels from a junior member species that nobody in the galaxy took seriously was not a development that warranted restructuring 4,000 years of institutional confidence. Then the full scaling analysis finished processing. It did not finish processing simultaneously across both fleets by design. The sensor systems were running independently and the processing time varied by hardware. But the interval between the Coalition's analysis completing and the Keth's analysis completing was short enough that the practical experience of both fleets was nearly simultaneous. 2 very different groups of people looking at very different displays, arriving at very similar experiences of what it felt like when the number that came back did not match any category you had been built to understand. The Coalition tactical officer who pulled up the completed scaling data looked at it with the professional attention of someone doing their job and then looked at it again with the attention of someone who has just had their understanding of a situation fundamentally revised. Each of the 6 human vessels was not a ship in any category the Coalition database contained. The database had extensive classifications, from the smallest scout vessels to the largest capital ships of the most militarily developed Coalition members. It had been built over 3 centuries of comprehensive documentation of everything that every spacefaring civilization in the region had ever put in the sky. The 6 human vessels were larger than the largest classification in the database. Not marginally. Not in a way that suggested a new subcategory just above the existing maximum. In a way that suggested the existing maximum had been built on an assumption about what was possible that was simply wrong. The power readings were worse. Better. Both. The sensor systems that the Coalition fleet was running had been calibrated to measure power output across a range that covered everything anyone had ever built. The calibration range had a maximum because calibration ranges always have maximums and the maximum had been set at a level that covered every known vessel class with comfortable margin. The 6 human vessels were producing readings that exceeded the calibration maximum. Not by a small amount. By enough that the sensor system was returning an overflow notation. The specific technical flag that a measurement system produces when it is being asked to measure something outside the range it was built to handle. The Coalition tactical officer had been working sensor systems for 11 years and had never seen an overflow notation on a power output reading. The notation was in the system because the engineers who built it had included it as a theoretical safeguard. Nobody had expected it to actually appear. She flagged the overflow notations in the data and sent the full package to Fleet Command with a note saying that the readings appeared to be accurate based on cross-system confirmation and that the overflow notations were not the result of equipment failure. Fleet Command received it and the commander looked at it and was quiet for a moment in the specific way of someone updating a model they had been operating from for a long time. In the Keth fleet, the scaling analysis produced a result that the senior sensor operator sent to Fleet Command with a message that said simply, "Please review this directly." He did not offer an interpretation. He had been doing sensor analysis for 20 years and he did not have an interpretation that fit the established framework, and he was not willing to file one that didn't fit because a wrong interpretation of what he was looking at was more dangerous than no interpretation. Keth Fleet Command reviewed it directly. The senior commander was a figure with 3 decades of expansion campaign experience behind him. He had personally overseen 11 successful engagements. He had a comprehensive understanding of the military capabilities of every species the Keth Empire had encountered, absorbed, or assessed. That understanding was built on data, and the data had always been adequate for the situations it was applied to. The data he was looking at now was not adequate. Not because it was incomplete, it was very complete. Because the complete picture it was showing him did not fit the framework that 30 years of experience had built, and he did not have an immediate way to reconcile the two. He sat with the scaling figures and the power readings and the overflow notations for a long time. One of his tactical officers sent him a message through the internal command channel. The message was 3 words. "What are those?" The commander looked at the display. At the 6 contacts moving through the approach corridor at standard approach speed. Running their identification beacons. Broadcasting on the Coalition's tactical frequency. Completely unhurried. Completely calm. Moving with the specific confidence of vessels that knew exactly where they were going and had no concerns about what they were going to find when they got there. He did not have an answer for his tactical officer. He had 30 years of experience and 3 decades of successful expansion and the combined military capability of everything the Keth Empire had ever defeated and the most capable sensor systems that 3 absorbed civilizations had been able to produce. And he did not have an answer. He looked at the power readings hitting the overflow notation again. He thought about the engineering literature on upper limits and the conclusions that every major civilization had reached about what was possible. He thought about those conclusions and about the 6 contacts on his display and about the gap between them. He sent a message back to his tactical officer. It said, "I don't know." In 30 years of expansion command he had never sent those 3 words to anyone. He sent them now because they were true and because the situation he was looking at was one where the truth was more useful than a confident answer that wasn't one. Outside the jump point the 6 human vessels continued their approach. Steady. Unhurried. Getting no smaller on any display that was tracking them. Getting, if anything, larger. The engagement lasted 11 hours. Not because it was close. It was not close in any sense that the word close applied to. The Coalition fleet's commander, watching the tactical display from his command position during the first 40 minutes, would later describe the experience as observing something that redefined his understanding of several concepts he had considered stable. Concepts like advantage, like scale, like the relationship between numbers and outcome in a military engagement. 4,000 Keth vessels. 6 human ones. The math had seemed straightforward before the scaling data finished processing. After the scaling data finished processing, the math was a different kind of straightforward. The human vessels did not rush. That was the first thing everyone watching noticed and the thing that stayed with them longest afterward. They moved into the engagement zone at a measured pace, formed a deliberate configuration, and began what would later be described in the official Coalition after-action report as a structured and methodical operation. The language was accurate and also entirely inadequate for what it was describing, but accurate and inadequate was what after-action reports often were when the events they were documenting did not fit the existing framework for documentation. The Keth fleet's response in the first 40 minutes was professional. The commanders had recovered from the initial period of not having an answer and had moved into the decision-making mode that decades of expansion campaign had built. Assess, adapt, apply capability. They applied everything they had. The sensor overflow notations had given them information they didn't have a framework for, and they had done what experienced military commanders do when they encounter something outside their framework. They used the tools they had and trusted the capability those tools represented. The tools were significant. 4,000 ships worth of the most capable military technology the Keth had ever assembled. supplemented by 3 absorptions worth of additional capability. In any engagement that fit the parameters the Keth had encountered in 8 years of expansion, those tools would have been more than sufficient. The engagement did not fit those parameters. After 40 minutes the Keth Fleet Command made a decision. Not the decision to fight harder, they had been fighting as hard as the situation allowed. The decision to transmit a stand-down inquiry on the emergency channel that the Coalition's collective security framework maintained for exactly this kind of situation. A channel that existed because the people who built the collective security framework had understood that war's ending was better than war's continuing and had built the infrastructure to support that possibility. The human vessels received the inquiry and responded within 60 seconds. The response confirmed that the stand-down channel was active and that any Keth vessel that ceased active engagement and broadcast on the stand-down frequency would be treated as non-hostile. The first Keth vessels began broadcasting on the stand-down frequency within minutes. The next 10 hours were the structured process of an engagement unwinding. Not all 4,000 Keth vessels stood down simultaneously. The communications across a fleet that size took time to propagate, and the decisions were made individually by individual commanders who each had to arrive at the same assessment on their own timeline. The human vessels maintained their operational configuration throughout and continued applying pressure to vessels that had not stood down while treating vessels that had as exactly what the stand-down protocol said they were. It was, from a purely operational standpoint, the most organized conclusion to a major military engagement that any of the Coalition observers had ever witnessed. It did not look like what people expected a decisive engagement to look like. It looked like something that had been thought through very carefully before it started. The debrief was 3 days later. The Coalition chamber was full in the way it had been full for the emergency sessions of the past weeks. Everybody present, everybody on time, the specific attendance pattern of a collective that has experienced something significant and is doing the work of understanding what it means. Ambassador Cole Briggs sat at the human delegations table with the same expression he had been wearing since the coordination request arrived on his desk 3 weeks ago. The expression the translation office had noted as difficult to categorize. Up close, in the chamber, the Oresi senior ambassador, who was sitting close enough to observe it carefully, would later tell his staff that it was not a smug expression and not a satisfied expression and not any of the things he had expected it to be. It was the expression of someone who had been patient for a very long time and was still being patient because patience was not a strategy they had deployed for the engagement, it was just how they operated. The questions started. A junior Coalition diplomatic staff member asked first, clearly the question that everyone in the room wanted answered but that the senior members were waiting to see if someone else would ask before they did. She asked why humanity had not mentioned the warships. In 40 years of building them. In 60 years of Coalition membership during which there had been hundreds of sessions and thousands of communications and endless opportunities to say something. Cole Briggs looked at her directly and said, "Nobody asked." The room was quiet for a moment. He did not elaborate. He did not frame it or soften it or add context that would make it easier to receive. Nobody asked was the complete answer, and he delivered it as the complete answer because it was accurate and because accuracy was the mode he was in. The Thessari envoy asked the follow-up that the first answer made inevitable. She asked why. Not why humanity hadn't mentioned them, she had heard that answer. Why humanity had built them. What the reasoning was. What the assessment had been that produced this specific output over 40 years. Cole Briggs said they had read the same reports everyone else in the Coalition had been reading about the Keth expansion. They had read them starting about 15 years into the expansion's build-up phase when the pattern was beginning to be identifiable, and they had done what humans tended to do with a pattern that concerned them, they had followed it forward. They had asked what the expansion looked like in 10 years, 20 years at full development. They had asked what would actually be required to stop it if stopping became necessary. Not to slow it down. Not to make it expensive. To actually stop it. And then they had gone and built that thing. He said it in the same even tone he had used for every answer. Not proud. Not modest. Just describing a sequence of events that had occurred and that he was reporting accurately. The room absorbed this. The Drenali senior representative asked a technical question about the operational doctrine, the stand-down intervals, the structured approach to the engagement. She was a precise and analytical person, and she wanted to understand the methodology. Cole said the doctrine came from a basic position that humanity held about armed conflict, that ending it was always preferable to winning it, and that any doctrine which didn't build in real opportunities for the other side to stop was a doctrine that had already decided on the outcome before the engagement started. He said humanity preferred to give the other side every chance to make a different choice before the final option was applied. The Oresi senior ambassador had been quiet through all of this. He had the expression he had worn since the observation deck 3 weeks ago. the expression of a very experienced person doing the ongoing work of revising a model they had held for a long time. He waited until the room had processed the previous answers. Then he asked his question. He asked how many more there were. Not a vague question. A specific one. How many human vessels of the Titan-class category existed beyond the 6 that had been at the engagement? Cole Briggs looked at him. The expression the translation office had noted as difficult to categorize was doing the thing it did, present and readable and somehow still not quite landing in any category that had a clean name. He told him the number. The room was quiet. Not briefly quiet. Not the polite quiet of a room that is processing something and will return to conversation in a moment. The sustained quiet of a room where the number that has just been said is moving through every person present and the movement takes time because the number is significant enough that it requires time. The Oresi ambassador sat with it. He looked at the table. Then at Cole. Then at the table again. The junior staff member who had asked the first question had her hand partially raised to ask a follow-up and had stopped raising it when the number landed. She stayed like that for a moment and then quietly lowered her hand. Third attaché Vaughn of the Drenali delegation had his computation unit out and was looking at it and then not looking at it in the way of someone who has already done the calculation and does not need to do it again and is deciding whether the calculation is something they want to engage with right now. Cole Briggs sat at the human delegation table and waited with the patience of a man who had been waiting for 60 years and had become very good at it. Eventually the Oresi ambassador said something. He said it quietly and to the room generally rather than to Cole specifically, and what he said was, "We have spent 60 years making decisions about our relationship with humanity based on an assessment that was comprehensively wrong." He said it the way he had said the similar thing in the emergency session weeks ago, as an honest accounting of the record. Not self-flagellation. Just accuracy. He said, "The question we now have in front of us is not how to manage a junior member. It is what kind of relationship you build with a species that did all of this quietly for 40 years, showed up when it mattered with exactly what was needed, gave the other side every chance to stop before pressing to conclusion, and when asked why they never mentioned it said nobody asked." The room stayed quiet. Cole Briggs picked up his water and drank some of it and set it back down and waited to see what the room was going to do with the question. He was good at waiting. He always had been.